This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi. Welcome to Hubwonk, a podcast of Pioneer Institute, a think tank in Boston. On August 16th, 2022, President Biden signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act, an ambitious piece of legislation that, among many of its provisions, promised to help reduce drug costs for seniors by having the government negotiate prices directly with drug manufacturers. While many hailed this new power as a welcome weapon to protect patients and taxpayers from predatory pricing, many healthcare economists caution that interventions that effectively set prices on drugs would distort market price dynamics and jeopardize incentives for the development of new therapies. Now, on the second anniversary of the bill's passage, the Biden administration has identified its first 10 target drugs, their negotiated price, and the projected $7.5 billion of savings for consumers and taxpayers. How does the IRA empower the federal government to negotiate these prices? How does the administration measure total savings? What effects are evident today of setting prices for drugs? And what are the likely long-term effects of extending additional price controls over a longer list of therapies for consumers and taxpayers in the future? My guest today is Pioneer Institute's Director of Life Science Initiatives, Dr. Bill Smith, who has researched and written extensively on the dynamics and regulatory environment of the pharmaceutical industry. Dr. Smith will discuss how the Inflation Reduction Act targets drug pricing and describes both the first-order savings expected from the initial price negotiations and the future effects on how new therapies will likely be developed and priced. He will share his views on the IRA's long-term effect on the output of the pharmaceutical industry as more drugs fall under the purview of federal price controls. When I return, I'll be joined by Pioneer Institute Dr. Bill Smith. Okay, we're back. This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi, and I'm now pleased to be joined by Pioneer Institute's Director of Life Science Initiatives, Dr. Bill Smith. Welcome back to Hubwonk, Bill.
My pleasure, Joe. Glad to be here.
Oh, great. Well, it's always good to have you on the show. You're a fan favorite, a listener favorite. But the topic I want to talk about today is something that you and I have discussed in the past. It's essentially the reasons for and perhaps remedies for the high cost of prescription drugs. That's your expertise. You come from that world. And so I want to enlist your help in understanding some recent claims that came out. We're now passing the second anniversary of the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. Did a lot of things, but among the more substantial or important aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act was that the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, it gave them the power to negotiate drug prices for many of the more expensive drugs used by seniors on Medicare. Now, we've heard recently the Biden administration has come out to declare that this has been a ringing success, that the law has successfully saved seniors and taxpayers tens of billions of dollars. What I hope to do in our conversation today is to examine the goal of the law, the method that it used to, or tried to use to save taxpayers or seniors money on drugs, how much it saved, if any, and what the effects of these effectively controls on the prices that can be charged for drugs are likely to have on our system in the future. So with that's my goal. So let's start at the beginning. The claim, of course, is drug prices and healthcare in general are just too high. By your observation, how much has the high cost of drugs or the increasing cost of drugs been part of the story about increasing healthcare costs?
I think the role of drugs in the cost of healthcare has been greatly exaggerated. Most analysts agree that drugs cost about 14% of the healthcare dollar. Some people say it's 10%, some people say it's 18%, but most agree that it's less than 20%. Healthcare costs are driven by hospitals and other things that aren't related to drugs.
Right. So we know drugs can be expensive, and in large part, it's owed to, the cost, the way they're able to, essentially charge such high prices for a particular drug is what we know as patent protection. You invent something and you get to sell it exclusively for a certain period of time. As you mentioned, once it's no longer protected by that patent, it goes generic and helps to control the price over time. But between you and me, Bill, how much does it cost to make a pill? Why is it that the drugs ever cost so much?
Well, it's R&D costs. The business model of biopharma is have very, very expensive upfront costs. And some people argue it costs as much as $3 billion to research a drug. And then low manufacturing cost. That's just the business model. You know, it probably costs 5 cents to manufacture a small molecule pill. But you can't say that the manufacturing costs are the only cost, because the companies have spent enormous money discovering the molecule.
Right. So, but nevertheless, we were talking about a very, very expensive. Ultimately, when the drug that presumably sick folks need, it comes to the market and it's expensive. So, what we have here with the Inflation Reduction Act is to empower the government to effectively, represent a very large community of Medicare users, and they want to negotiate on their behalf for a better price, use that market power to negotiate a better price with the drug companies. How does the government negotiate, or how did this come down the line? What is the government's approach to negotiating for these drugs?
Negotiation is an Orwellian word in this context, because the IRA essentially is price fixing. It's not price negotiation. If a company doesn't agree to the government's price that is set, the company will have a 1900% excise tax, which is an enterprising, threatening level of taxation. So it's price fixing. It's not negotiation.
Yes, I read the CMS's own release, and effectively they say, we haven't fixed prices, we haven't set price caps. Rather, we have negotiated. But again, it's almost laughable that the way it presented. It said, well, we gave them a number and they either agreed to it or they didn't. As you mentioned, it's sort of the sword of Damocles over the drug company's head. If they don't agree to the price, then there, as you mentioned, there'd be a 1900%. I thought it was, they characterized it as a surcharge or a surtax on those drugs that are overpriced. So effectively, it's not like a traditional negotiation. It's sort of an offer you can't refuse.
Right. Accept the price or we'll put you out of business, essentially.
Yeah, right. But okay. Let's say, all right, the government comes in and says, look, these the drug prices. I think there's right now there's 10 drugs that are have been negotiated, and for this next year, and then 15 beyond that. Is that the ambition?
It's 10 this year, 15 next year, 15 the year after, and then 2020. So within a few years, we're going to be at 60 of the biggest drugs in Medicare are going to be subject to price caps.
Yes. Okay. So now, okay, depending on where you stand on the wisdom of this movement, let's just say the drugs are less, the price is less than it would be had the IRA not been passed. So for some of our listeners, I'm sure that sounds like generally a good thing. So let's just say across what I'm going only by what CMS is in their press releases have claimed. They said on those 10 drugs, they have negotiated between 38 and a 79% discount. And to put a fine point on it, they say if this bill or law had been passed last year and applied to this year's drugs, it would have saved Medicare $6 billion and would have saved the people who use those drugs $1.5 billion. This seems like a win. I'm going to call it like I see it. At a high level, are you comfortable with this math, with the CMS assertion that it saved effectively, you add them together, the $7.5 billion for people who consume these drugs?
Well, I don't know what the cost savings are going to be. And my concern is that senior citizens in particular, but patients are going to have less access to drugs. And the reason for that is we have this system in place where drug companies pay rebates to get onto a drug formulary in a good position with low out-of-pocket costs, low copays. And when you knock the price down substantially, the rebates are going to go down. And the question is, are PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers who set the formularies, are they going to disadvantage the drugs that are price controlled because they're going to get less rebate revenue? That's the question. I don't know the answer. But it's possible that the price controlled drugs are going to be harder to get for senior citizens.
You brought up an important point, and I suspect that the CMS, these are very, very large numbers of savings, again, on only 10 drugs. To me, it seems like Medicare, the CMS is using the drug retail price to measure the savings that they've negotiated. Is that how it works in the real world? Do consumers or ultimately the insurance companies pay the retail price, or is it something else that sets the price before this, let's say?
Yeah, the CMS press release isn't worth the paper it's printed on. They compare list prices with the negotiated price, negotiated, and nobody pays list prices. These almost all drugs have rebates attached to them. Some have more rebates than others. Diabetes has more rebates generally than cancer, but almost all drugs have some form of rebate, which means the price gets knocked down by the rebate that's paid by the drug company. And the rebates are off of list price, which is the list price that, or the retail price that would be cited in the press release.
Right. Um, so the consumer is paying less than retail in the real world. So the price negotiated by CMS, it has an influence, but perhaps not the magnitude that they claim. Um, Forgive me for asking such I think an obvious question. Um, if I'm a drug company and I want to create a drug and set its price, and if CMS is scoring the value of their intervention by the amount they can negotiate, is it fair to assume that the response to this intervention by CMS is to increase the retail price that they ask for those drugs, because it's easier for CMS to make wild claims about savings if I price my drug at $1,000 a dose rather than $100 a dose. And if I'm not part of Medicare, I need that drug, I'm not part of that organization, I am paying retail or close to retail. Doesn't this increase in retail price have a knock-on effect of making me, not in Medicare, pay more?
Well, what's going to happen, I think, is that launch prices of drugs are going to go up. There's a provision in the IRA that says if you increase the price of a drug above the inflation rate, you have to rebate that money back to CMS, back to the government. And what that means is that if you have a drug that was modestly priced and it turned out the drug is highly effective, more effective than you even thought from the trials, and safer than you expected, you'd want to raise the price on that. This inflation provision prevents you from doing that. So what drug companies are going to do is launch drugs at higher prices rather than lower prices, because they can't increase the price once it's on the market, even if it proves very effective.
Also, right, if CMS has negotiated the price downward in the case of the 10 drugs, it leaves less room for insurance companies also to, that's kind of crowding out the role of insurance companies to negotiate these prices downward as well. Is that fair?
Yeah, except that, I mean, the negotiated price is supposed to, in the beginning, only apply to Medicare. But the Congress slyly decided they were going to announce the prices. And so I would expect commercial insurers are going to start to ask for the negotiated price, the Medicare price.
So essentially, CMS is negotiating the price of that drug for everyone. So in theory, we all might see some benefit from that negotiation.
Right. Well, you just don't know. What I'm concerned about is generic drugs. Generic drug companies make their money. They make their profit in the first 6 months. One company will get exclusive right to sell a brand name drug when the patent expires, and they'll go into the market with a generic, and they'll sell it maybe at 80% of the price of the branded drug. That's where they make their profit, in those 6 months. But if the government has whacked down the price by 80% in the beginning, what incentive is there for a generic drug company to get into the market right away? I'm concerned that generics are going to exit the market or suffer consequences from this.
I want to drill down on this concept, because I think for our listeners who are not paying attention to these kinds of issues, this is kind of complicated. I just want to go back to something we talked about at the top of the show. We talked about that a drug company spends billions of dollars, develops an effective drug and markets it, and it has, a window, 7, 10, 15 years in which it has an exclusive patent. It's the only company that can sell that drug. And as such, it can command the price it wants, right? It's separate from,
Well, but there are other molecules that could work on the same disease that compete. You have an exclusive right to sell only that molecule, but there may be other molecules that come along, and We've seen this with statins. 4 or 5 statins entered the market. All the molecules were different, and companies had a patent on them, but they competed aggressively on price.
That's fair enough. So they don't have a free hand because there is still, let's say, substitution competition, right? Something that's close but not exactly the same. That it constrains their prerogatives as far as pricing goes. But I think you bring up an important point that you mentioned at the top of the show that the cost of drugs does not represent a large percentage of healthcare costs, and it's not going up largely because of this phenomena whereby any drug, as good as it is, falls off its patent, and then ultimately someone else can produce that same exact molecule for less. And the lower the drug price, if negotiated by CMS, the less the incentive is to create an alternative. I saw something in a research paper. I'm not sure if it was authored by you, but there is a relationship between how many generic manufacturers come in to produce a drug after it falls off patent and the ultimate reduction in price. That is, the more people who try to make it, this follows logically, the cheaper it gets for ordinary consumers. Say more about this phenomenon.
Yeah. So when a patent expires on a branded drug, FDA chooses one generic company that can sell the drug exclusively for 6 months. That's it. 6 months. And they make enormous money from that particular period because they can price the drug close to what the branded company, and they didn't do any R&D. So all they have to prove is that they've copied the drug effectively. Then after 6 months, other companies can come in. And I would say the first company probably reduces the generic price. The generic drug is probably 20% lower in cost. Once 2 or 3 companies come in, it drops 40%, 60%, 80%. And by the time 5 or 6 companies come in, the drug price has reduced by 90% compared with the branded price. So the generics create enormous savings in the system.
So, okay, again, I want to underline this concept. So we've got a drug that, let's say, it costs $100. And they sell it successfully on patent for 10 years. The developer makes their money. Then it goes generic, and for 6 months, another company maybe prices it at 80 and is competing with the $100 drug, but it doesn't have the name brand. So the consumer, who wants the generic saves some money. And then after that 6 months, all kinds of other companies come in and sell it for much lower. And that $80 now goes down to $5 or $10. And it remains at that price forever. So effectively, all of us enjoy much, much cheaper drugs because of the invitation of these generic producers that produce something that had been very expensive, but from now on till the end of time will be very, very cheap owing to the competition amongst generic drug producers. That's
exactly right. And what generics do is give us access to high technology drugs very quickly sometimes after 10 years or 8 years, and at very inexpensive prices.
So again, I'm going to tie to our theme today. When we're talking about price controls for expensive drugs, that CMS comes in and says, look, you're selling this drug, we think it's too much. We're going to mandate, lest you want a $1,900 fine, a 1,900% fine, you have to sell it for less. The effect of that is to compress all of these numbers, which is to say it leaves much less incentive for the first manufacturer of the generic and even less incentive for others. Still takes work. So what you're saying is by mandating these drugs cost less, ultimately in the short run, we save a lot of money. In the long run, because there's not much competition for generic, we all pay more for that same drug because there's little incentive to reproduce it inexpensively.
Yeah, I don't know what will happen with generic market, but it is ominous that the government is knocking the price down so low, it's creating disincentives for generics to get into the market, disincentives that don't exist now.
Right. Well, okay. Well, again, what I try to do is tie these kinds of issues to more broad issues that sort of apply, to our discussions on other matters. Not, drugs, are products that are being sold just like any other product on the market. You've asserted that, essentially this is effectively setting price controls on a particular item. Arguably, price controls on a drug is different than price controls on, fishing poles or watermelons, but it's still price controls. So it seems to me that most people intuitively, or certainly economists, know price controls in general are bad for consumers. That is, if we set limits on the price of milk, farmers will take their dairy cows and sell them to the butcher, right? It will have less milk to buy because there's less incentive to make it. Dairy farmers, are in the business of making profit, not making milk. So, following that logic, this seems like it would have all kinds of perverse incentives. But I've heard people defend this IRA price control as saying, yeah, sure, Joe, I agree. In a perfect market, price controls are a really bad idea. But our healthcare system is this Byzantine, pile of perverse incentives that don't, price theory goes out the window. We're really working in a world where everything is controlled, everything is mandated, and there's no relationship between price and value. In this sort of bizarro world of drug prices and our healthcare system, isn't it a bit naive to think that price signals are really what should govern the price of drugs? Do you see any sympathy to CMS's instincts to control the price of drugs in the healthcare system?
Granted, I will grant that drugs are different than other commodities, but they don't defy the laws of economics. And the laws of economics are such that price controls drive scarcity. So if you price control bread, you're going to get bread lines. There'll be less bread out there. If you price control drugs, there'll be fewer drugs. Now, there's debate in the policy analyst community about how many fewer drugs there will be. The CBO, at the time the legislation was going through, said, oh, it will only impact 13 drugs over 30 years. And the CBO projected that there would be 1,300 drugs approved in the next 30 years. So it was a 1% hit, a very modest hit. But other analysts have come along. There's a couple of economists from the University of Chicago that estimated that biopharma revenue, because of the IRA, will drop 31%, which is astounding. That's an astounding number. And the Chicago economists projected that there will be 135 fewer drugs. And there are other studies that have corroborated that. So my guess is you're gonna create some scarcity in drugs with price controls.
So again, this is perhaps familiar ground for people who are well-versed in economics, that if you take away the incentive to create new drugs, that is, if you reduce the amount of profit for after a drug is produced, you remove the incentive to invest in the first place. I saw one, I think it was a press release from the White House saying, criticizing drug companies for spending more on dividends and stock buybacks than they do on research, as it, sort of asserting that dividends are spending rather than distribution of profits. If we then essentially take away the profits, we take away the investment, which, as you mentioned, would mean fewer drug companies. What baked into this idea, or sort of this indifference towards future drugs, it's almost as if these policymakers, at least, believe we've already discovered everything, and that we're pretty much all set, that the drugs we have work pretty well. There's not much more to worry about in the future, that these future drugs are sort of icing on the cake and not essential. What would you say to those people who are rather sort of indifferent to your claim that new drugs will essentially, the conveyor belt for new stuff is going to dry up with these kinds of policies?
Well, this is that, to say it's Pollyannish is doesn't overestimate it. I mean, there are so many rare diseases that still need cures. There are many common diseases like diabetes that still need cures. We don't have the armor for all drugs, for all therapies, and we need to continue discovery. And if you believe that we've discovered all we're going to discover, you could make drugs cheap by just taking patents away from every company. The drug prices would drop dramatically, and there'd be no R&D, no future drugs.
Yeah, well, I think you make the claim sort of almost as if it were absurd to accept, but I think there are a few people in our listening audience who would say, well, that doesn't sound so bad. But what for those, again, I've had this kind of conversation with people I respect and who are at least public health or policy healthcare experts. And I've said, imagine then if we were to have arrived at this wonderful point whereby we don't really care about future drugs. We think we're just about all set right now. Imagine if we had made that step 50 years ago or 100 years ago, we'd be asking patients to sort of deal with their ailments with leeches or a towel around their head. I think it's wildly naive. You had mentioned on an earlier podcast that we're sort of on the eve of a breakthrough, a renaissance in drug development. Say more about what you think is sort of essentially we're coming to these price controls at exactly the wrong moment in
Yeah,
scientific.
I'll quote, I think I quoted Larry Summers last time, and what he says about clinical research, medical research, is that if medical research were art, we'd be in the high renaissance right now. The amount of discovery that's happening right now is mind-boggling. We've mapped the human genome. We know what genes are responsible for what illnesses, and we're inventing cures for those. And in steps price controls, which is a great disincentive to, for example, because price controls in the IRA impact the Medicare population, Medicare drugs, there's a disincentive to find cures for the elderly. I mean, if a venture capitalist is looking at different programs to finance, different clinical programs to finance, a program for a young person's drug is going to be more attractive than an older person's drug, because that older person's drug could get sucked into the price control regime.
Yeah, of course, yes. And I'd also say to our listeners, I think perhaps we're all terrified of one common disease, which is Alzheimer's. Imagine, 50 years hence, we've cured Alzheimer's. Think of the hundreds of billions of dollars that we would save if we had the quote unquote cure for Alzheimer's. I don't know if it's imminent, but I think to myself, certainly it's worthy of our best effort to try to figure it out for all of us. And I think, well, again, if we imagine we've discovered everything we're going to discover already, that brave new world of free of Alzheimer's will never occur. I'm going to move on to another claim. Let's say that folks have sort of in support of price controls for drugs, which is that other countries are essentially enjoying the fruits of our labor. In other words, we spend all this money developing these drugs in the U.S. Largely, I think it's roughly 50% of all drugs are discovered here. And the rest of the world is enjoying those same drugs for much cheaper prices. We hear all kinds of stories about people driving to Canada or what have you. Say more. Why is it that it seems to be that these drug companies are milking American consumers and the rest of the world is getting away with murder?
Yeah, they are getting away with murder, and it should have been a trade issue for the United States for many years. The problem for pharma companies in particular is that their business model, that is high upfront R&D costs and then low manufacturing costs, that business model is particularly susceptible to freeloading, because a company that approaches, say, Great Britain and says, please buy my drug, Great Britain knows they've already sunk $2 billion into discovering the drug, and they can manufacture the pill cheaply. So why should they pay what the market price is for the drug? Why not just freeload? You don't see this freeloading happening with companies that have high manufacturing costs. Like, nobody in Great Britain can buy a Ford F-150 for $15,000 because the manufacturing costs are so high. Ford Motor Company is not going to sell it that cheaply. But you're talking a different situation when it's a pharmaceutical company. They've already spent $2 billion to do the R&D. And if Great Britain is only going to offer 50 cents on the dollar, they're probably going to take it because they have to make up those R&D costs as effectively as they can. So the business model is subject to freeloading, and that's what's happening. Europe freeloads off our defense spending, and they freeload off our pharmaceutical R&D. There's just no doubt about that.
Well, let's stay on topic with the price of drugs. Again, we're talking more broadly about a key feature of the Inflation Reduction Act. This was, as the name implies, supposed to reduce inflation. We'll let our listeners, decide for themselves whether it accomplished its goal. But it's also supposed to save us money. The deficit of, I think it was supposed to save $90 billion. I don't know if you saw a recent article that the CBO has come out and evaluated the cost of the Inflation Reduction Act. Have you seen anything about the savings that the Inflation Reduction Act has enjoyed since passage?
Yeah, when the bill was going through, the CBO, because their patrons are Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, the CBO said, "Oh, this bill will save $90 billion." After the bill passed, and a year later, they reevaluated that and they said, "Oh no, we were wrong. This is going to cause $562 billion in deficit. This bill is unpaid for. We're going to have to borrow money to pay for it." So the CBO has been wrong about this, and I think they're likely wrong on the number of new drugs that are going to be impacted by this bill.
Yeah, indeed. Now, we're getting close to the end of our time together. We're going to have a new president one way or the other in January. I think, if ironically, the conversation about price controls is top of mind for a lot of people. We see some people defending it, and I'm always interested in hearing those who want to defend price controls. But in general, it seems economists and even the intuition of ordinary consumers seems to be that they intuitively know that you limit the price of anything, eggs or hot dog buns, you're going to see fewer of them, and ultimately either you'll be on a long line or the item won't exist because there's no incentive to create it. What do you think in this case when we talk about the incentives and the effects of price controls on drugs? Do you think future administrations, either side, seem to understand the unintended but harmful effects on drugs in the future, both cost and availability, would be? Do you see anybody who seems to quote unquote get it?
I think no, I don't. To be honest, I think the Trump administration, previous administration, was all over the map on drug prices. They stepped in and made drug prices in Europe a trade issue, as I wanted them to. But then they were all over the map, and they said kind things about price controls. And JD Vance has actually said good things about negotiating drug prices in Medicare. So I don't see anybody that really gets it. There were a few people at the Council of Economic Advisors for Trump that understood the business model and said the right things, but the administration as a whole was all over the map. And the Kamala Harris administration would be the same as the Biden administration. I think they would inflict as massive price controls if they could.
And just to be clear, again, I would say, candidate Harris was the 51st vote to when it passed the Senate because it was 50-50 tie. She signed it, and of course, so did President Biden. So I have to believe they're at least till recently, unless it's changed, sympathetic to its provisions. I like to ask this of all our experts: if you were king for a day, is there any degree of price controls that makes sense when considering the short-term cost for consumers who need these drugs desperately, and long-term costs for all of us for both inexpensive drugs and new drugs to keep us healthy in the future? Is there any place for these kinds of provisions in your view?
No, and no, I don't think price controls are a smart idea. They're going to diminish innovation. There's no doubt about that. On the other hand, I do think the government could do a few things to help with out-of-pocket costs, because out-of-pocket costs have been rising because of PBMs substantially for people. So people are paying hundreds of dollars sometimes for a prescription, a monthly prescription, and I think the government could do something about that without defying market forces.
So to step in and essentially help people pay the price, at least while it's under patent, rather than go after the drug company itself.
Or give people access to the negotiated net price, minus the rebate. Right now, people who are paying cash at the pharmacy might pay the list price, the retail price, which is not right if their insurer has knocked down the price 50% through a rebate. So people should have access to the discounted price that their insurers get, not the list price.
Again, we're treading on familiar territory. We've done podcasts about this topic in the past, and I appreciate, in a sense, we all agree that the price of drugs is high, the price of healthcare is high, where we disagree is on how to deal with it. I think, if I'm hearing you loud and clear, it's the market's business to set prices, not governments, and that in the long run, we're all poorer with perhaps the well-intentioned but misguided effort to control prices with price controls. So thank you very much, Bill, for joining me again on HubWonk. I wanted to address this issue because there's a lot of press on the issue right now. And I think it confuses a lot of our listeners as to whether.
Yeah, Joe, ominously, just to bring it back to Massachusetts, there's a contract research company that runs clinical trials called Charles River Laboratories. And last week they announced that they were seeing a diminished number of clinical trials coming out of the greater Boston area. And the CEO specifically pointed to the Inflation Reduction Act price controls. He said, this is diminishing the number of clinical trials that biotech firms are conducting. I mean, the reality is this is going to diminish innovation.
Indeed. And to be clear, I'm familiar with that firm. The CEO is a neighbor. But what they do is they facilitate the testing of drugs of other companies. In other words, if I'm developing a new drug, I come to them to sort of run trials for me. What you're saying is the company that runs those trials is saying fewer and fewer trials are coming in because, again, as we would predict, or an economist would predict, taking away incentives for developing new drugs means fewer new drugs will be developed. I mean,
precisely.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Bill. Where can our listeners read more about your research and your work?
Well, I have a couple op-ed pieces out there, and I will share them when they're published on the IRA. And we're doing considerable research, which won't probably be up till the end of the year, where we're going to look at what happens to these price-controlled drugs. Are they more widely available? Are they costlier or less costly for seniors? We're going to look at their formulary status, and that will be published on the Pioneer Institute website.
I think that would be a wonderful complement to our conversation, because at the end of the day, you and I are predicting the effect, but ultimately, when you do the research, you'll measure the effect.
Exactly.
In theory, detractors or supporters can't equivocate with results. So I look forward to that. Perhaps we'll have you back to discuss this topic again in the future.
Sounds good. Thank you, Joe.
Very much. Thank you for your time, Bill. This has been another episode of HubWonk. If you enjoyed today's show, there are several ways to support HubWonk and Pioneer Institute. It'd be easier for you and better for us if you subscribe to HubWonk on your iTunes podcatcher. It would also make it much easier for others to find us if you offer a 5-star rating or a favorable review. Of course, we're grateful if you share HubWonk with friends. If you have ideas or comments or suggestions for me about future topics, please feel free to email me at hubwonk@pioneerinstitute.org. Please join me next week for a new episode of HubWonk.